From the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., this is Rendezvous with History, a podcast that captures the drama of presidential decision-making. Dr. Anthony Eames sits down with prominent scholars and leading citizens to bring to life what happens in the White House and how it shapes the world.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Welcome back, Rendezvous with History listeners. As always, I'm your host, Anthony Eames, and I'm here today with Bill Haldeman, Chief Strategic Officer and Vice Chancellor of University of Pittsburgh, and more importantly for our purposes, the author of Meeting the Moment, Inspiring Presidential Leadership That Transformed America Out, SUNY Press in 2024, so you can get it all over the place, including on Amazon, where I picked up a copy. Bill, good to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, Bill, you know have a kind of a good perch or a good set of experiences with which to author this book. You know, you grew up in the Northeast, in the kind of eastern seaboard of the United States, where our first American presidents have come from and where presidential history seems right around kind of every corner. You spent some time in the White House, in the State Department, in a governor's mansion or office. And of course, you have the academic pedigree to boot. So you have a set of experiences in education that have seemingly led you to kind of meet this moment of your own to write this book. And, you know, as you progressed in your career, what was that kind of nagging impulse along the way? How did that develop to say, Bill, sit down, start putting words to the page and getting out your thoughts on the American presidency?
Well, like you said, I think from the beginning, it's something that's always been a passion of mine. I've got a PhD in this. I love the American presidency from as far back as I can remember, but having the experiences I've had working in places like the West Wing of the White House, to the State Department in DC, to having gone through crises myself, I've always thought, and I was always interested, going back, again, as far back as I can remember, is what was it about leaders in those moments? And I'm looking at the leaders that I was with in those moments too. What was it about them that made them go in a certain direction? What was it about their decision-making model that led them in a certain way? And I wanted to kind of look at what was it about the best presidents in those key moments? What was it about them that stood out? What was the key quality that essentially transformed America? And for me, the genesis of this goes to that, but goes back to a voice recording that I did on my phone on my way to work one time. This is probably going back, it's probably been about 10 years. And I found it, and during the pandemic, had the opportunity to think about it more, right? And I just started writing. Got up at 3-4 o'clock in the morning and just started to write about it. And started with Washington, and then one thing that led to Jefferson, to Lincoln. So it really started that, and having that extra time, the quiet in the morning to do it. And it's just something that I've been thinking about for a long time, obviously with the voice recording, but even before that.
Yeah, so you're keeping what I call writer's hours or author's hours. So many of us up at 3 or 4 in the morning before everything starts with the rest of the day and kind of steals your ideas away from you. But so you zero in on 6 traits, and I want to know why these 6 traits. So to put them out in the open, it's judgment, it's ingenuity, dedication, courage, confidence, and optimism. Okay, there's a lot of traits that we think about with American presidents, some good, some not so good. But why were these the traits that kind of rose to the top for you, that were clearly the most important variables in the equation for strong, decisive, positive presidential leadership?
Because these were the traits that came out in the best American presidents, in what I viewed in that sense. You look at someone like Washington, probably had a bunch of these qualities, right? He had courage, but the story that I tell in the book, it's about his judgment. So it wasn't so much that I was picking judgment as a quality. I was picking Washington to start, and I looked at what was it about Washington in that moment that transcended America, and looked at that. For each of of these leaders. And the interesting thing of 6 of our best presidents, it was all a unique quality. It wasn't just, certainly Jefferson or others had, there's an element of confidence or optimism that they had. But it was each of these, it was a distinct quality for each of these leaders. And that's what I found in doing the research. So it started with the president, and then through the president, their quality really percolated up.
So there's a second way you've approached this book, not just kind of leadership traits that some of the greats exhibited, starting with Washington, ending with Reagan, but also the way you found those traits expressed. And that's through the words, through the kind of key speeches that are now so central to our national collective memory. And you can inadvertently, or sorry, I shouldn't say inadvertently, you purposefully weigh in on kind of a bigger debate in the scholarship about, do presidential words actually move the American public? Do they in some ways actually matter for governance? And here we have maybe on one end George Edwards, and on the other end here Bill Haldeman. How do you come down on this?
So if I'm taking out and teasing out these 6 leaders and these 6 moments and these 6 documents that are in these books, I think all of these moments and these documents in particular are central to exactly that, to moving a nation. When you think about George Washington, his farewell address continues to resonate today. I mean, he was telling us about the dangers of national unity, the dangers of foreign influence in our politics. These not only resonated in that time, the 1790s, which were some of the most divisive years in American history, but they transcend to today. So we're still talking about national unity. We're still talking about foreign influence in our politics, where Washington might have been dealing with the French and the recalling of a French ambassador in the off-year elections of 1794. We were talking about 2016, there was this element of, was there Russian interference in our elections? We're still talking about this. And then one of the other key points that Washington raised in his farewell address is the idea of having foreign feelings, or having a stronger feeling for a foreign nation over America. This was a veiled shot at Jefferson at the time. But it's that type of document. If I look at something like FDR in his first fireside chat, that he moved the nation with the power of his word. It was warm Hudson Valley tone over the course of over America's radio waves to explain what had happened over the first week of his administration that pulled us out of the banking crisis, which was threatening the nation. We were on the brink, if you will. And then you look at someone like Ronald Reagan, where he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. 29 months later, the wall came down. So I can't, for me personally, I can't think but that presidential rhetoric matters, because is a cause and effect with so much, and this book really highlights that.
Warm Hudson Valley tone. You truly are a son of the Northeast. I think that's the first time I've heard that expression, although I'll keep it in my back pocket for the next time a good opportunity comes up to use it. You've spoken a little bit. You gave us a snapshot of the speeches, that you focused on. Washington's farewell address, Gettysburg, the Brandenburg Gate. What are your favorites of these 6? What was the kind of work, the kind of scholarly work, scouring the archives, connecting the dots, that allowed you to see that those qualities, those traits expressed in those speeches, and how they actually moved the American public in the direction the office holder wanted it to go?
Sure. I'll start with the second question. Obviously dove into the primary sources to start. I wanted to know what Washington, like for instance, if you look at Washington, I want to know what he was feeling in that moment. Why did he want to step down? Why did he want to step down 4 years earlier and decided not to, based on the fact that from Hamilton to Jefferson talked him out of retiring? I wanted to essentially go into the rooms where they were making these decisions, where they were taking their quill and taking that to the parchment to express what they were feeling in that moment and why that was so important to America at the time. So for me, it was going back to the primary sources. I wanted to feel what those rooms were like. For instance, going to Gettysburg myself, I wanted to trace the steps of Lincoln at Gettysburg. What was he experiencing when he went to Seward the night before giving the Gettysburg address, to ask him to essentially look at the document? What was that like? What was he thinking about in those moments? Or Reagan in particular, we can get into that in a little bit. Looking at the sources of the NSC or the cables coming from the State Department that were against him saying those 4 words to Gorbachev at that time. I really wanted to experience what they were feeling. So that's where it started. And obviously going back and reading secondary sources, reading the who has written these histories in the past, and to bring that to life and to really elevate a perspective around what this was. But to get at your first question, I'd say, all of them are really good. I'm hard pressed not to pick Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. 272 words, essentially 10 sentences, 4 paragraphs, half an op-ed. The eloquence in just 272 words and what he said, and how that transcended and went back to the Declaration of Independence and the spirit of Jefferson, but and then talked about the past, the present, and the future. I'm hard pressed to go beyond that, but each of them are so unique. And I'll mention also, not just speeches, but Jefferson's letter. It was a demarche letter It was April 18th, 1802. His demarche letter to his French ambassador, Robert Livingston, set the tone and tenor for really what became the Louisiana Purchase. And I think it's important what that was. Being in the room with him, when you talk about primary sources, I wanted to know what it was like. He would spend 12, 13 hours a day which is now the Lincoln dining room on the first floor of the White House. But to experience what it was like, he was basically living there by himself with a few aides. He had Meriwether Lewis there with him. But what was that like? What was he experiencing, knowing that the French were on our doorstep and that was an existential threat to America? So really pulling out those types of thoughts and primary sources. But again, I probably would go with Lincoln of all, but it's really hard over the course of those 6 different presidents.
Well, since we are the Reagan Institute, let's zero back in Reagan. And you mentioned the NSC council minutes, the kind of State Department advice on don't say tear down this wall to Reagan. And on each of these traits, little reflection from the reader leads one to think, when is it for a president the right time to follow their instinct, to follow their gut, to follow where their set of experiences has led them into a certain decision-making process, and when is it appropriate, or when is the right time to listen to those advisors, to listen to those people they've put around them? I mean, what's the right balance there? I mean, is there a pattern that you see where presidents who listen in this way are successful and presidents who follow their gut in that way are successful? Or, how does that come out in your book?
I think, that's an open question, right? I think in the case of Ronald Reagan, we talk about his optimism. This is something, and in each of these leaders in particular, it was the quality that we talk about in the book is something that's unique to them. But unique to their experience going back to their childhood. Optimism was something that was inherent in Ronald Reagan as from the moment he came on Earth. Certainly from his mother, I think you see a similar aspect of Reagan and his optimism coming from his mother. In the same way, FDR elicited a lot of his confidence from his mother. So the qualities generally coming from a parent in some way, that there's this sense of upbringing that comes to the fore. And I think Ronald Reagan throughout his life, the sense of optimism was always there. He was everything that kind of fell in his way. If he pushed to get into college, right, and he didn't have a scholarship, he followed his girlfriend, his high school girlfriend, to college, and ended up getting a scholarship and getting aid to get into college. From just the range of experiences he had, there was an optimistic sense that always emanated from him. And I think in that moment, when you feel that, I think he was optimistic about Gorbachev at Geneva, at Reykjavik. He said he looked him in the eyes and he felt like it was somebody he could work with. And I think that there's an element of optimism, but there's also a diplomacy and EQ. You're reading people. And he understood that he could work with Gorbachev, that those 4 words to Gorbachev, he was not pressing him. It was an optimistic state. Everybody else viewed it, the Secretary of State, from the National Security Council, even Colin Powell was going to get into almost a little bit of a fisticuffs with the speechwriter, Peter Robinson, who was writing the speech around this, that they didn't want this said. But he believed that from an optimistic way, that these were not this was an optimistic phrase. This was giving hope to people basically on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And I think that it was embodied in him throughout his life. And there's a through line throughout his life I think he was trusting his gut because he knew from an optimistic way that he could work with Gorbachev.
Okay, so we kind of started with Reagan. Let's walk it back, president by president, theme by theme. Confidence, and that warm Hudson Valley accent.
Sure, FDR. I mean, it comes back to his mother. She taught him to believe that anything was possible. He certainly came from an affluent background, very affluent in that sense, but he believed that he could be president of the United States. There's a great story when he was a young child. His father took him in to see Grover Cleveland, and Grover Cleveland tapped him on the head and said, basically talked him out of trying to be president. But he would tell that story when kids would come to the White House or come to the Oval Office. But that was always in his mind, the sense of confidence. But it had to have that, and to overcome the things he did, from polio to a range of issues he had to across his life. But it was his confidence that gave the nation confidence. So he came in 1933, March 4th. We're essentially in the middle of the banking crisis. Herbert Hoover had struggled to essentially give the nation the confidence it needed. And FDR had won that election in 1932. He comes in, and he really didn't have a plan, which was the crazy thing about it. It was almost like this idea of a startup, right? He was throwing stuff against the wall. Hoover's people stayed in an element of trying to, not national unity, but a sense of patriotism to try to help through this. But it was the sense of throwing things against the wall. And after a week, he wanted to go on the radio, which at the time was the medium of choice. He was the right person for the role. And we talk about the warm Hudson Valley tone. This would be the same as John Kennedy and the television, or maybe even President Trump and social media. This was the proliferation of this at this time, and he was the right carrier of this. He had been building this since he was governor in 1928 in New York, and he learned to cultivate the radio. So when he got on the radio, it was his first fireside chat. It was about 15 minutes long, and he just slowly and deliberately and just like gave a 101 on what he had done over the last week to ensure that the banking crisis could be solved, and to give confidence for people to return their money to the banks. There was bank runs. There was 1930, when he came in, we were at a point where GDP had declined 30%. The stock market had declined 33%. It was a run on banks. There was foreclosures was across the country, and he gave the nation confidence. Like that was basically the floor of the Great Depression. Like it was only going to get better from there, and his confidence gave the nation confidence. And I think that again there's a through line back through his childhood, but you see it at every stage, and that was the quality that he exhibited most in that key moment, in the key transformational moment, and it was the key moment that defined him.
Well, from one Roosevelt to another, Teddy embodies, in your estimation, courage, which I suppose most would feel that way about Teddy Roosevelt as well.
Yes, completely. And what's interesting about his courage. He was born a sickly child. He taught himself. There's a great quote about teaching himself how to be brave. He was picked on because he was a sickly boy, but his dad helped him to build up his body. He became stronger, and the vigorous life is something you always think about with him. But the interesting pivot point for him in his life came on Valentine's Day, 1884. In the same house, his mother and his wife died. His wife died after complications of childbirth, and then his mother died on the same day. And he wrote a big X in his diary. It said basically the light had left his life. So he went to the Dakota Badlands, North Dakota, Medora, North Dakota, and he basically went to find himself. And through that, there was this sense of conservation that was always there. He was always a naturalist. But he embraced that, and he also saw the importance of the West in terms of America's growth. And he was right. Between essentially 1910 and 2020, no other area in the country had more growth than the West, and he was right about that. But the key to unlocking the West was ensuring the water retention, so dams, canals, because the only way you survived in the West at that point is unless you were living right next to a river system. So you see Las Vegas and these types of places are a result of ultimately the foresight of Theodore Roosevelt to help move the nation in that direction. So the confidence I talk about, or the courage, but with him, is that he became president in September of 1901. William McKinley was shot in Buffalo. He's 42 at the time, and then he turned 43 in October. By December, he had to give his first State of the Union address. And in that, he felt he wanted to take on the existential threat of his time, which he felt was the eradication of natural resources and this issue around the growth of the West. So he took almost well over, I think it was about 11% of this draft, and focused on these two core areas. And for me, it was the courage to do that in a time when they weren't the topics in the cloakrooms in Congress. This wasn't part of the political vernacular largely in America, but he believed it. And I think it's good to see that in a leader, because we need more of that, where we take on those types of issues that matter and are going to be important for not only this generation, but the generations to come. So we see that with him, and I think courage defines him. There also, I'll mention a great story about his courage. So it's after he was president in 1912, he was giving a speech at the Gilpatrick Hotel in Milwaukee. He was running again, it wasn't really a third term, but it was technically, it would have been his second term. He didn't end up winning, but he was shot in the chest with a .32 bullet. And instead of going immediately to the hospital, he gave the speech. He pulls a blood-soaked speech out of his pocket and continues to speak for 84 minutes. And he says it's going to take more than one bullet to kill a bull moose, which was his party, the Bull Moose Party. But he gave that speech and then was rushed to the hospital. But the courage of Theodore Roosevelt in something like that moment, but particularly in giving that State of the Union, or which was really an annual address to Congress, was his defining quality for sure, his courage.
Well, and not an advisable thing. Generally, if you're shot, you should go immediately to the hospital. But certainly, given the fate of his predecessor, an important and courageous moment, even more so.
Yeah,
we covered Lincoln and Gettysburg a bit, and not just us, but others. Why don't we jump to getting into a little bit about this Jeffersonian ingenuity. Jefferson, the debate about Jefferson seemed once upon a time settled. And over the last 15 years ago, he seemed to become once again a character, a president of enormous interest and disagreement over his effects, over his intentions, over his ideas, over his, personage. Multiple Jeffersons at play here. So you pick out the Jefferson who's known for ingenuity, who practiced that trait in a uniquely gifted fashion.
Yeah, we touched upon it earlier about his letter and his demarche letter to Robert Livingston. But I mean, he was a man of ideas. I think you think about the element of Jefferson as someone who just embodied that sense of being an intellectual in that sense, but really having a sense of the moment. I mean, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. He penned that. But I think in terms of that was an important moment in American history. But when we talk about his presidency, it was the decision making around the Louisiana Purchase, which to me was the defining moment of his presidency, but also, again, shows his ingenuity that he took the initiative to send the demarche letter. In doing so, he bypassed his own Secretary of State, James Madison, in doing so, but he set the tone and tenor for that debate in which ultimately ended up being in France in terms of the diplomatic aspect of it. But I think what was most important about that is he fundamentally understood from his time period, from being a diplomat in France before America was a nation, right after essentially the American Revolution was over. He understood that to embarrass Napoleon was to essentially be an act of war. And he knew that to do so, he was putting America in an existential crisis that they probably would not be able to recover from. That was not would be a good strategy. So he worked a back channel through a gentleman named DuPont, and in order to work through that channel, so not to embarrass Napoleon, not stand before Congress and denounce. Denounce the French in any way, he was able to work that channel. Long story short, in that process, he also, when he wasn't seeing as much progress, Jefferson was someone that could be impatient. He wasn't seeing as much progress from Livingston as he would have liked. He called upon James Monroe, who became a future president, to help. To go to France to help negotiate the end of this deal. But by that time, Livingston had done also, which I think Livingston is one of the unsung heroes here. I think there should be a book written about him in that sense. There is a biography, but I think even a biography in this time about Livingston's role. I mean, he's one of those unsung people in American history. He was there. He was one of the five folks that were part of the committee that wrote or was responsible for the Declaration of Independence. He was with George Washington. He actually gave the oath of office to George Washington in New York, and he was also he was the chief diplomat in getting us a Louisiana Purchase, which fundamentally changed the whole dynamic and form and shape of the United States. Fascinating person, but by that time, Livingston was able to close the deal. Monroe came, and I think there's an element of ingenuity of how Jefferson shaped this negotiation that led to the Louisiana Purchase, as well as his ability to get this through Congress and on national security grounds, because there was talk about whether he needed a constitutional amendment to get this treaty ultimately signed and done. And there was an element of ingenuity around that. But so collectively, there's an ingenuity, just to kind of frame that is certainly, in my view, Thomas Jefferson's defining quality. And it goes back again to his childhood, how much of a learned scholar he was. There was probably nobody more learned in America besides maybe Ben Franklin in that sense that was more worldly than Thomas Jefferson.
Well, we are, offline. Well, I should say this. It sounds like your next book is on Livingston, but offline, you and I were talking about our kind of hints for history, and it seems quite a few people have approached you and asked, okay, you've let us know why presidents can meet the moment and succeed and lead. What about when presidents fail to meet the moment? Is that something that you see as being an important contribution to our understanding of American presidency?
I think it's really important. I think you look at someone like Herbert Hoover, who's a fantastic person. Like, he just was the right person at that time. It's seeming like if you were hiring someone and looking at someone's CV to be president in 1928, there was nobody better for that. Or even to someone to handle the Great Depression. He was a 2-term Secretary of Commerce. He was the great humanitarian. He had the nickname coming out of World War II, the great humanitarian. There's no one on paper that was better than Herbert Hoover. But the question is why was he not able to meet that moment? And so getting back to the communication part that we talked about earlier, I think that it really came down to FDR being a better communicator. He was able to move the nation in a way that Hoover was not. There was a caricature made of Hoover in that sense of there was the Hoover blankets or all of the things about him that became part of that narrative. And I think you look at someone like him. Why was it? What was it about Hoover that was not able to meet the moment? Or someone like, I look at the exact opposite. That was a Republican. You look at a Democrat like Jimmy Carter. Again, the range of issues that he faced in basically the late 1970s, from inflation to energy crisis to the Iran hostage situation, all of these things stemmed up. And another really good man, right? He was a governor. Like, what was it about him that didn't work? And the messenger, Ronald Reagan, had the ability to have that sense of optimism to lead the nation in the way that the nation needed to go to get out of that malaise. So thinking about those types of examples, what was it about those? I think I've heard from people saying that would be really neat to look at the opposite side, as you say. And I think that could be a really interesting book as well.
But what comes out is through all of this, communication is key, and that each of the presidents you've laid out have a defining characteristic, that unique characteristic, be it judgment, be it optimism, be it courage and confidence, that is essential to kind of a broader strengthening of the nation, of American democracy, but they're only able to succeed in those moments of crisis or those moments of opportunity by effectively communicating those traits through their words to the American public. And that really comes out strongly. Well, Bill, this has been just a wonderful conversation. Really hope that all our listeners go out, pick up a copy of Meeting the Moment. We look forward to more from you, and hopefully presidents will pick up your book as well and take some lessons from it, and we'll continue to meet the moment as we go on. Once again, Bill Haldeman, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me. It's been great. Appreciate it.
Rendezvous with History is a podcast produced by the Ronald Reagan Institute's Scholarly Initiatives. You can learn more at ronaldreaganinstitute.org and follow along on social media at Reagan Institute.